All right, we're coming back, everybody. Get ready. All right, before we go into Taylor's talk, I just want to say a quick thanks to Nexmo for sponsoring Laracon Online. That's a really cool, basically API platform for communications. So you can obviously like send SMSs, make phone calls, you can validate phone numbers, you can do all that sort of stuff. So if you're building anything that needs to communicate, do any kind of telecom communication, definitely check out Nexmo. Big thanks for sponsoring Laracon Online. Couldn't have done it without them. Definitely, if you can, say thank you to them on Twitter. And of course, check out their service. Really, really good stuff. Okay, so we're here with Taylor Otwell, the man himself. He's going to go through a bunch of Laravel-ness. Taylor, don't forget to unmute yourself.
Unmuted.
Uh-oh, you sound a little light.
Can you hear me?
Okay, that's better.
You may turn up my mic.
Yeah, I don't know. It sounds a little lighter than the other folks. Might need a little tweak here.
Test, test, test.
I think that's good. What do you guys think? Louder.
More testing. Test, test, test. Louder.
I wonder if you have the right mic selected.
Let me see.
It sounds like it might be on the computer.
It says audios. It's on the right thing.
All right. I mean, we can hear you.
Let me see. Am I any louder now?
Ooh, there you go.
Is this better?
Yeah, I think that's good.
Okay.
All right. So Taylor, you can take it away. Down, there's a button there to share your screen down below. Should say like new share. There you go.
Got it?
All right, you're good. Some people might want you to boost up that size, just FYI.
Okay, let's see here. I'll try to get how's this looking here?
Good. For those of you that don't know, Taylor does code at minute levels of font size. So
yeah, this is my coding font size right here.
That's ridiculous. Okay, take it away.
All right. Thanks for coming to Laracon Online. As Ian said, I'm Taylor. I created Laravel back in 2011. So Laravel is getting to be a little old now in terms of web technology, I guess, since things change pretty much every few weeks. But yeah, I created Laravel 5 years ago and actually started working with Ian at Userscape about 6 months after I created Laravel. Really, it's pretty soon after it came out. And while I was at Userscape, that's when Laravel 3 came out, Laravel 4 came out, and I can't remember if Laravel 5 came out while I was there or not, but pretty close to there. And, the whole gist of Laravel is to be really easy to use, but also really powerful. So to solve a lot of common problems in web development. A lot of the things I, set out to solve at first were like authentication, pagination, things that mainly drove me crazy in other web frameworks. I wanted to make them really easy. And 5 years later, the framework has grown a lot and more features have come in like database migrations, queues, event broadcasting recently, Passport for OAuth 2. And the community's really grown a lot too. And it's really cool to see everyone here for Laracon Online from all around the world. So today what I wanted to do was to kind of walk through Laravel internally as kind of what it looks like as a request comes into the framework and how the framework is sort of put together at a kind of fundamental level. Because I feel like if I understand how my tools work sort of internally, I just feel more comfortable using them and just kind of have more confidence as I'm developing software with them. So kind of what we'll do is walk through a request coming through the framework and look at both sides, the HTTP side and the console side, the artisan side. And try to leave time for a few questions too. I know people have questions, maybe not only about this, but just about Laravel in general and the ecosystem in general. Okay, so let's go ahead and hop right in. And I'll try to get through this pretty well. I've got quite a few stitches still in my mouth from this operation, but let's start in the index.php file of Laravel. And actually, before we get into that, let's talk about Laravel and kernels. And Laravel has two kernels. It has an HTTP kernel and a console kernel, and you have both of these in your Laravel app. And I know I can't make this sidebar bigger in Sublime, but if you go into your Laravel app and open app HTTP, you have a kernel file, which most of you probably are familiar with, is where you list your middleware, because that's really all that's in there out of the box. But you also have a console kernel file, which is where you can define console commands in your console schedule, where you can define how often certain things run. And these two kernels are sort of the main places that requests flow through your application, both HTTP requests and console requests. So those are two really important parts of the framework that we're going to look at. Okay, so let's talk about just the HTTP side for now and sort of follow a request through the framework and see what happens. And we're just going to start in index.php. This is where every request sort of comes into the framework, and you really can't make an HTTP request into Laravel without coming through this file. So let's just start here and kind of work through it. The first thing that the index.php file does is it loads this bootstrap autoload.php file. And this is a file that exists in all new Laravel applications. And all it does actually is require the composer vendor autoloader. And what that does is that's how, when you do new class name, PHP knows where to find it, because composer has registered an autoloader that sort of works based on conventions, right? So it matches either like namespaces to folder paths or whatever. But that registers all that. And Laravel 5.4, this file is really almost empty. It just has this one statement. In previous versions of Laravel, this is where we would load the compiled class file. So if you've ever run PHP Artisan Optimize, it would build a single file that contained, a lot of different classes. It was like a 30,000 line file. And the whole premise behind that was, disk IO is kind of slow. So if we can combine all these classes into one file, and we can just hit the disk one time to load all those classes. But with PHP 7 and the op cache in PHP 7, the performance benefits of that became pretty much negligible when you actually benchmark it and you have your op cache configured for production, which you look into. I think I've mentioned that a few times on Twitter, and Chris Fidel, I believe, has some articles on that too. But look into how to properly configure your op cache so that you're getting the best performance out of PHP 7, because it makes a huge difference in terms of your performance. Anyway, if you have that configured, there's not really a performance benefit to compiling all those classes. So that's removed in Laravel 5.4. All right, so that's the autoload file, really simple. Now, the next line requires this bootstrap app file, which returns an actual app instance. And this is a very important part of the framework, which we'll dig into here a little deeper. So let's jump into the bootstrap app file. And what this does is it's actually responsible for creating sort of the root application class of Laravel. So we create the application, and then the application sort of serves as a dependency injection container. And the reason it's like this, which may seem a little weird at first, is when I first built Laravel 4, this is sort of in the pre-alpha days of Laravel 4, a lot of Laravel was going to be based on Silex. And at one point in the early days of Laravel 4, I even considered building Laravel 4 on top of Silex so that it would actually extend Silex. And that's how Silex works, is the application container is, or the application class is also dependency injection container. And so that's why that's why Laravel works like that, because it sort of was a nice thing, a nice pattern to follow, and I sort of kept that, even though we didn't end up building Laravel 4 on top of Silex. So after we create the application instance, we're going to bind a few things in the container. We're going to bind the HTTP kernel and the console kernel. And remember, those are those two really important classes that I mentioned earlier that are sort of the entry point to all requests coming into Laravel. So we want to get those registered really early in the request lifecycle. Okay, so there's two contracts those two kernels implement. So we have a HTTP kernel contract and a console kernel contract, and we're going to bind implementations to our app kernel and our app console kernel. So that's going to get those registered really early because we're going to need them, really early in the life cycle. And we're also going to register the exception handler because that's obviously another really kind of foundational part of the framework is to be able to handle exceptions. So we want to go ahead and get that in the container really early as well. All right, and once that is done, we just return out the application from this script. So anytime I need a fresh instance of the application that's sort of not been tainted with anything and it's sort of a pure instance, I can actually just require this file, which is kind of cool. And we do that in another place in Laravel. So of course we do it here in the index.php where I was just showing you. But another place we actually do this is when you're unit testing Laravel or doing controller tests, we need a fresh instance of the application on every test. So like if you were to look in your test case, sort of the base test case of Laravel, you can see it uses this creates application trait. All that does is require that bootstrap app file that I just showed you. So we do it from here as well. And then it just bootstraps the console kernel and returns it. So it's sort of a convenient file because it lets us easily get a fresh application instance when we need one. And we do that both from the index.php file and from your base unit test. But anyway, that's kind of an aside on how the unit testing sort of resets the application on every test. So that, for instance, if you mock something in a test, in your next test, that mock is not there anymore, because the whole application has sort of been flushed out and we have a new one without that mock binding. All right, so let me look at my notes here and see if I wanted to say anything else about that. Looks pretty good. Oh, yes, about the container. While we're talking about the container, I wanted to also point out that a lot of people ask me about, using the container outside of Laravel. And the container is actually, I think it's one of the most powerful parts of Laravel, and it's one of the easiest to use outside of the main framework. And I wanted to kind of show you an example of that. So all you actually really need to do, say you're working on like a legacy project or a project that's not built using Laravel, but you really want to use the container. You only need to pull in the Illuminate Composer package. So, pull in Illuminate or container, I said Composer. Pull that in using Composer, and then all you need to do to use it is just create a new Illuminate container instance, and you can start pulling stuff out of the container. So for example, if I just die and dump, which is the most popular function in Laravel, if I just die and dump this something class, it works. You don't really need to do any configuration or anything like that. So that's a really easy package to get started using outside of Laravel if you're not using Laravel in a project for some reason. Okay, so let's see. Yeah, so back to this index.php file. So we got a fresh instance of the app. So let's keep walking down through this file and see what happens next. So we've registered the autoloader. We have a fresh instance of the app / dependency injection container, and we're ready to proceed handling the request. So the next thing we're going to do is resolve out a instance or an implementation of that HTTP kernel. So remember, we already bound that to our app HTTP kernel. So when we call this app make on line 50, we're going to get an instance of our app HTTP kernel. And each kernel, both the HTTP kernel and the console kernel, have a handle method, and they are sort of the only method you would ever call on either of the kernels publicly. And all they do is they take in input and they give out a response. So in the HTTP kernel's instance, it's going to take a request. The console kernel is going to take, for example, console command options and switches. Okay, so we're going to pass in this HTTP request. All this capture method does is really sort of build an HTTP request object from the current PHP global variables like post and server and cookie and file and whatever other global variables there are. Okay, and once we call handle, we get back our HTTP response, which we can just call send, which will send it back to the browser. And then we will call the terminate method on the kernel, which all that does is look for any middleware in your application that are marked as, quote, terminable middleware. It's kind of a hard thing to say. But there's a couple middleware in Laravel that are terminable. And like the session middleware, for example, which we only save the session sort of after the response has already been sent. So kernel terminate will call any of those middleware and make sure they have an opportunity to just sort of clean up anything they need to do. All right, so I kind of like the simplicity of this file because I think it sort of models the overall simple idea of what a web framework should do. It takes in a request and then just sends out a response. So it's a very good sort of model of the simplicity of the web in general, I think. So let's go ahead and take a deeper look into the kernel because that's where the framework actually is going to boot up and do interesting things. So I'm going to hop into Foundation HTTP kernel. Now, of course, as I said before, you're probably familiar with the kernel as mainly a place where you register middleware. So for example, if I look at my app HTTP kernel, it's just got these middleware arrays. I've got global middleware in, this protected middleware property. I've got middleware groups, which are going to be assigned to specific routes in my application. Right here where I've got some middleware that apply to my web request and some middleware that apply to my API request. And then down here, I've got other route middleware that I can assign sort of as I need to various routes, things like authentication or authorization, rate limiting, stuff like that. Those are all sort of route level middleware. Whereas the middleware up here are global middleware that apply to every single request coming into my application, and they don't have to be assigned to specific routes to apply. All right, and Laravel 5.4 actually has a couple new global middleware, trim strings and convert empty strings to null, where trim strings will sort of trim out any extraneous spaces that exist on any of the request input, and convert empty strings to null will normalize all empty strings to just the null value. And that sort of makes validation a little simpler and easier because you can make certain assumptions about your input. Okay, so the first thing the Foundation kernel does when it's created is actually loop through those middleware that you defined and register them with the router. Now, you can see it type hinted the application and the router, and those dependencies are automatically going to be injected when we create the kernel back in our index.php file. So when we call app make, of course, the container in Laravel is smart enough to sort of automatically inject the dependencies we need using reflection, which is sort of I think it's some irony that Laravel sometimes is thought of as being good for just prototyping quick applications or whatever, but the dependency injection container and queues and event broadcasting and things like that actually make Laravel a really compelling PHP framework for heavy enterprise development. Okay, so once we get all the middleware registered, let's jump down into that handle method that we wanted to look at. Now, you can see it's taking in the request, which is what we sent in from the index.php file. Sometimes I get asked, why is this request not type hinted, both here and also in middleware? So like, see if I have a middleware here. App HTTP middleware. Like right here on a handle method on a middleware, you'll see that the request is not type hinted. And sometimes I get asked, why is this not type hinted to illuminate HTTP request? And one of the reasons for that is when I was first building out some of this middleware stuff is when PSR7, the so-called Framework Interoperability Group, came out with PSR7, which is sort of a request, HTTP request interface standard thing for PHP. And there was some question as to whether Laravel would adopt that. And so that's why we chose to leave off the type hint here. So that would keep it flexible if we ever wanted to adopt anything like that. We wouldn't sort of have to make a breaking change there, hopefully. Anyway, so that's just a little side note on why that's like that. As it turned out, I didn't really find PSR7 easy to work with or really all that compelling in general. So we just stuck with the Illuminate HTTP request, which I think is quite a bit more convenient. Okay, so once we get into the handle method, we're going to enable HTTP method parameter override, which sort of just lets you spoof form requests, where if you've made forms in Laravel, you might have done that underscore method input on your form, which lets you sort of spoof like a delete request from a post form, for example. And that's a Symfony method, which the Illuminate HTTP request is built on top of, that just sort of allows that and enables that. Okay, but the next thing we're going to do is send requests through router. So let's jump down here, and this is where we can really get into some meat of sort of bootstrapping the framework. So the first thing we're going to do is register the incoming request into the container. And we're also going to clear out any request facade. Now, I wanted to make a note here about using the request in your application. And the request is available in the container, mainly so that you can do things like this, so that you can come in here and type hint the request and get it on this route. And that's why we put the requesting in the containers, to make that really easy. Now, nothing is really stopping you from type hinting the request on your other application classes. So, for example, if I had some random class in my application that's, like a job or something, it's not a controller or a middleware, I could, in theory, come into this class and, type hint the request. Now, I wanted to point out that even though this is possible, I don't really recommend you ever do this, because the reason you don't want to do this is, say, for example, this class was bound in the container as a singleton, which means that the container will only create one instance of this class for every sort of framework lifecycle that exists. If you have this class bound as a singleton and you're type hinting the request in its constructor, if your application ever makes some kind of sub request where the request comes in and then somewhere using some package that makes like a sub request back into the framework, your class is never going to get that updated request, because it's already been constructed. So don't really ever type hint the request as a constructor parameter. Keep it as like a route dependency or like a controller method dependency, and then pass in specific parts of the request into your deeper application if you need to, like a single input value or a header value or whatever you need to do. Anyway, just a little aside on the request in the container while I was in there. All right, so once we do that, we call this bootstrap method. Now, remember, it feels like maybe a lot has happened already, but the framework is actually still not able to actually do anything. We've created the application in the dependency injection container, but we haven't actually put much in it. We've put the kernel in it, the HTTP kernel and the console kernel and the exception handler, but that's about it. For instance, we couldn't, encrypt a value or put something on the queue or make a database call or something like that, because the framework doesn't know how to do any of that stuff yet. It's still just kind of an empty dependency injection container. And this bootstrap process is what's really going to add on the meat of the framework so that it can do stuff. Okay, so we only bootstrap the framework one time. So you can see in this bootstrap method, we're going to make sure the application hasn't already been bootstrapped. And then we're going to call bootstrap with and pass it some bootstrappers. Now, in this foundation HTTP kernel, there is a property of bootstrappers. And you can actually override this in your own application kernel if you needed to. If you needed to add something that should happen very early in the framework lifecycle, you would add it here. Okay, so what these bootstrappers do is they each have one kind of single thing that they do. And they're pretty small classes in general. So, for example, you can see that we have a bootstrapper that says load environment variables. And what that's going to do is, you have your .env file, for example, in your project. That's going to load in that file and set those environment variables. We have another bootstrapper for load configuration. That's going to load in all your config files from the config directory and sort of get those ready so that you can interact with them, and then also that they're available to the framework. We have a handle exceptions bootstrapper, which is responsible for registering the various exception handlers with PHP, like set exception handler, set error handler, things like that. We have register facades, which is going to sort of register all the class aliases for any facades you might be using throughout your application. And then what I really wanted to get to down here is register providers. Now, what this is going to do is loop through all the providers that are registered in the config app file. So you have in your config app file, you have an array of service providers. And each one of these service providers adds on a feature to the framework. So for example, like the encryption service provider, if I jump into that, all it does is all really service providers do is add stuff into the dependency injection container. And so if you look in this register method, the register provider's bootstrapper is going to call the register method on every provider you have in your configuration. And that's going to give it an opportunity to bind anything it needs into the container. So if I hop into the encryption service provider, which is sort of a core Laravel service provider that makes it possible to call the encrypt function, it's going to bind an encryptor into the container and it's going to do various things. Now, it doesn't actually make an encryptor. So it just binds a callback that can be used to create an encryptor when it's needed, sort of a factory of sorts. Okay, and so that whenever we need to encrypt something, it's going to resolve this out of the container, and then you have your encryptor and we're good to go. And it's going to do that with every service provider. So for example, the queue service provider, which is a little bit more involved, registers, several things to do with queuing jobs. It registers different connectors and different failed job handlers, the worker, the SQS connector, the Beanstalk connector, the Redis connector, all that stuff is sort of the service provider's responsibility to put into the container. All right, so it's a really important part of the framework, and a really key thing I think everyone should understand is that the service providers are really responsible for adding the features into the framework. So most packages you install, they're going to have you list a service provider in your providers array. And the reason for that is it gives the package an opportunity to bind things into the container. And a service provider can do a lot of different things. Like the framework ships with an app service provider that lets you register your own things in the container. And of course, you could make your own other service providers, but you could actually build entire apps that existed as packages and just use service providers to sort of load in the routes, because there's helper methods on service providers like load routes from, where you give it some path to your routes that will make sure that those routes are loaded when your service provider is booted. There's other things that let you register commands. So sometimes people think that, you can't do sort of modules with Laravel they're sort of self-contained applications and packages, but you really can do anything from a service provider. You can load routes, you can register events, you can have controllers in your package that are loaded. Anything you want to do, really. So keep that in mind. It lets you build pretty advanced packages. For example, Laravel Spark, which is a whole, sort of SaaS application bootstrap that includes views and routes and controllers, that all exist as basically a single package. So service providers are very powerful because they're so flexible, I think. They don't ship with a lot of properties and options to set, but they sort of give you this one function to do anything you want, which I think is really flexible and convenient. All right, so jumping back into the kernel, the register providers, of course, is going to call the register method, and then boot providers is going to call the boot method. Now, each service provider can have both of these methods, or sort of either or one of these methods. So some service providers may not have a register method. They might just have a boot method, and some might have a boot method, or a register method, but no boot method. And the difference between these two methods, which can be a little bit confusing for people at first, is, for example, an app service provider, I would never want to try to access something that was registered by another service provider. So for example, I would never want to try to encrypt a value from the register method in a service provider. And the reason for that is, if I, for instance, in my config app file had, app providers, app service provider class, if I had this at the top of the array, the register method of this would be called before the register method of my encryption service provider. So I would get an error that says, the encryption stuff is not available, basically. So never call anything in the register method of your service provider that depends on another service provider being registered. So if you need to do something like that, you would always do it in the boot method. This gives you an opportunity to use things that other service providers might be giving to you. So for example, in the boot method, it's perfectly fine to call, encrypt something or to do whatever you want to do, really, because you're guaranteed that all other service providers have already been registered. Okay, so hopefully that's kind of a clear picture of what service providers are, but they're a really foundational part of the framework. And again, is another sort of inspiration from Silex, actually, when I was building Laravel 4, was to sort of maintain this service provider approach, because I think it's a super easy and flexible way to add packages onto Laravel. Okay, so that is the bootstrapping. So if you forgot, we were down in this send request through router thing, and the bootstrap method is sort of a lot of things happen when that's called, even though it's not a lot of code here in the kernel. So once we're through that method, all the environment has been loaded, all the configuration has been loaded, all the service providers have been loaded, and we're really ready to sort of handle the request. So what we do is we use this component of Laravel called pipeline, and this is actually a separate component that you can actually pull down into your own projects, and it's not a very well-known component actually of Laravel, but what it lets you do is send objects through other objects. So in Laravel's case, we use it to pipe the request through different middleware. So it will call the handle method on each object in the chain, and then it has a literal then method that tells me what I want to do at the end of the chain. So for instance, in this example, we're going to make a new pipeline. We're going to send the request through the middleware, and then we're going to dispatch to the router. So this is going to send it through the global middleware. We haven't actually found a route yet. We're still at the global middleware level. So we're going to call all the middleware that run for all requests. So this is going to be things like checking to see if the application is in maintenance mode, or trimming the input, or converting empty strings to nulls. Those are all global things that are going to happen right here. And I like to think of middleware as sort of an onion layer that your request pass through. So your request comes into your application and has to pass through these layers of middleware before it actually gets to sort of the meat of your real application, to sort of like a route or a controller. And any of these middleware in the chain can reject the request back out. So for example, a really common use case for middleware is authentication. And if we check and we see that the user is not authenticated, we can return our own custom response that says, hey, you're not authenticated, or return a redirect response that redirects them to the login page. So middleware are sort of the evolution of, if you've been using Laravel for a while, are the evolution of Laravel's filters, which filtered the incoming request and could be used for authentication and things like that. Now, while we're talking about middleware, I wanted to use this as an opportunity to sort of address something that can be confusing for people that are new to Laravel, and hopefully this will help clear up a few things. So one thing people do that's not possible is, for example, in your app service provider, they might try to access the current user, or they might also try to do this in, I've made a sample controller here called to-dos controller. And they might try to access the current user in the constructor of the controller. And if you try to do this, let me comment out my app service provider dump and close out some of these other files. If you try to access this route, and I've got a little dummy application here. I'm logged in. I think I've got it on the to-dos route. You'll see you get null, even though I am actually logged into this application. So if I go to home, you can see I'm logged in. But for some reason, I'm getting null if I try to access the current user in the constructor of my controller. And this may seem confusing at first, but I'm hoping this talk will kind of help you understand why this does not make sense to access the current user in the constructor of the controller. And remember that authentication is a middleware. It's something that's HTTP related. And in order to even know what middleware we need to run for a given controller, we have to create the controller. Okay, the same thing goes for like the app service provider. If I tried to get the controller here, or get the current user here, if I try to do this, again, I'm going to get null. And the reason for that is, remember where this happened in the life cycle that we've walked through already. We had that array of bootstrappers that called boot provider. Now, when we called boot provider, we haven't done any middleware. We haven't really done anything related to HTTP at all. As far as we know, this could be a console request. So it makes no sense to try to get the current user, because there is no request to get the current user from yet, as far as the framework is concerned. We're still just booting up. And hopefully that makes sense and helps you understand why you can't get the current user in certain situations in Laravel, because you need to do it at the right time to where it actually makes sense. So either in like a middleware or in a controller, once the request has been injected into your controller. So for example, if you wanted to get the user pretty early on in your controller, one thing you can do, which is a pretty cool feature of Laravel, is you could have like an anonymous middleware that's just a closure in your controller. So this is perfectly fine. If I have something like this middleware and then I try to get the current user in the middleware, this is fine because this runs within the middleware stack and after the authentication has already taken place. So if I do this and I hit the to-dos route, you can see that I actually do get a user array or a user model with my information. So just keep that in mind when you're working with Laravel, that you can't just try to get the current user anywhere you want. You sort of have to be mindful of where you are in the request lifecycle. Okay, so let's jump back into the foundation kernel. I think I'm in the console kernel. All right, so keep that in mind when you're working with Laravel, is to be mindful of where you are in terms of middleware and bootstrapping and all that. Okay, so once we send it through those middleware, we'll dispatch it to the router, which really just calls router dispatch, and that will return a response. So I'm not going to dig too deep into the router because it's sort of irrelevant to understanding how Laravel works at a core level. But the router will actually find the route that matches, the URI of the request. It will run any of the route level middleware, which that's where authentication is going to run and where authorization is going to run and where rate limiting is going to run and all of that. Those are all route level middleware that are going to be handled at this stage of the request. Okay, so once we get that, we're going to return that back out. And of course, it will pop all the way back out to our index.php file. And we will just call send, which will send it to the browser. And that's pretty much it as far as a request goes in Laravel. So hopefully that helps you understand how sort of HTTP requests come through the framework. Looking through my notes here to see if anything else I wanted to cover as far as that goes. I think that's pretty much what I wanted to say about HTTP. Now, I want to take a second and look at the console side of things. Now that we've seen how an HTTP request comes into the framework, let's look at a console request because it's actually pretty similar. So if I hop into, instead of index.php, just hop into the artisan file. This is where all of the console commands are going to be coming through. And it's a very similar feel to the HTTP or to the index.php file that handles HTTP requests. First, we're going to get our Bootstrap autoload file, which we already looked at. We're going to call the Bootstrap app file, which we already looked at, to get a fresh instance of the application. And then instead of the HTTP kernel, we're going to create the console kernel. And instead of passing an HTTP request to the handle method, which the console kernel also has, we're going to pass in some input objects. So we're going to pass in the Symfony console component argv input, which contains like all of the switches that you passed into your command and all of that good stuff. And then we're going to pass in a console output class, which lets you write out, informational warning and error messages back out to the console. Okay, and instead of an HTTP response, we get an integer status code. And then we're just going to terminate the kernel that gives it a chance to do any kind of cleanup stuff. And instead of displaying the response out to the browser, we just exit with whatever status code the console command returned. Okay, so let's go ahead and look into that kernel, foundation console kernel, and it's going to look pretty similar. We're going to bootstrap the framework first, and this is going to be just like the HTTP side. They're very similar. The bootstrap is going to call an array of bootstrappers, which are defined right here, which you can also override in your console kernel if you wanted to. I don't think it's very common to sort of have that need, but if you needed to override the bootstrappers for whatever reason for all artisan commands, you could do it in your app console kernel. But again, if you look at this list of bootstrappers, it's going to be very similar to the HTTP side. We're going to load our environment variables, load the configuration, handle exceptions, register facades. And the only thing different, I think, is about the console bootstrapping is the set request for console bootstrapper. which all of that does is sort of bind a dummy HTTP request into the container so that if you tried to generate a URL from like an artisan command, it wouldn't fail. It would have a dummy request to sort of go off of to determine the current HTTP scheme and all that stuff. And then we're going to register the providers and boot the providers just like normal. So we're going to spin through all those providers, call the register method, call the boot method, and the framework's going to be ready to go. All right, once that's bootstrapped, we're going to load any of the commands. So for example, this is where the routes console file would be included, where you can define any of your closure-based artisan commands, which is a relatively new feature to be able to do. Those would all be loaded there. And then we would just call artisan to run that command. And this is sort of the router of the console side, I guess you could say, where we use the Symfony console component and we hand it these inputs and outputs, and it finds the command that matches, that input signature and executes it, and then returns the integer status code. Okay, so it's actually very similar in overall structure to the HTTP side. And the only main difference is being that there's no middleware, of course, when running console commands, because there's no HTTP request, and it returns an integer status code instead of an HTTP response. But you can think of them both as sort of just different APIs into the brains of your application. So you're building your application and you sort of have this black box of powers that it gives you. It can do certain things. Like if you're building a to-do application, you can add to-dos, delete to-dos, mark the complete, and that's all part of your application. And you can expose that functionality through HTTP and through your console. And this is where both of those types of requests flow through, either the HTTP kernel or the console kernel. Okay, and they work very similar. So that is pretty much how anything would flow through the console component. And then we would just exit out. Okay, so that's sort of an overview of how Laravel is put together at a foundational level. It's really just dependency injection container, service providers, and feed input into the kernel and send the response. And anything that happens on top of that is really up to you. You're not even required to use any of the other features of Laravel on top of that. So anything you add into your controllers or routes, that's all built on top of that simple foundation, basically. And I think that simple foundation gives you a lot of power, right? Like I said about the service providers, it lets you build very robust packages and modules onto Laravel that have their own routes and controllers and events, because you can do anything you want within your service provider, register things in the container, and then in the boot method, register event handlers or routes or anything you want. So anyway, hopefully that gives you sort of an inside look at how Laravel is put together under the hood, and the kind of the foundational concepts of it. And it doesn't feel as much like magic maybe now, I hope, as far as how requests get handled and how your application is actually working under the hood. I also wanted to take a few questions. I tried to look at a few questions before I hopped in here. And one person asked a question that I actually get asked a lot, which is, how do I actually work on Laravel myself? When I'm working on a new feature for the framework, how do I do it? Do I modify the vendor directory of my Laravel application, or what do I do? And the answer is actually pretty simple. And I wanted to show you a couple things. One, how I do that, but then also how I build packages like Spark or Horizon or something like that. So what I do to work on the framework is I actually have this little Laravel application on my machine where I keep all my Laravel stuff. And I have another repository that's just the framework. So this is a framework, and I've actually got a pull request pulled down that I was working on earlier today. You can see I could switch back to like the 5.4 branch and say I wanted to make some changes to the framework. I actually have this command called Laracopy, which just symlinks it into my Laravel installation. So I can pull down a pull request here, run Laracopy, and now my Laravel dev site is running whatever framework PR I have pulled down. So I actually have a really simple approach for working on Laravel. I don't actually edit the vendor directory. I just symlink my copy of the framework into the vendor directory of the Laravel application. anyway, that it feels pretty clean as a workflow to me. But then also for packages, which I also get asked about a lot, there's a really great feature of Composer that I wanted to show you called Path Repository. So I've got two folders in this directory. One's package and one's package app. And let's pretend that package is sort of this new package we're building for Laravel. And package app is sort of this Laravel application that's going to be our test bed for testing our application as we build it, which a lot of people want to do, right? If you're building a package for Laravel, you want to be able to play with it in a Laravel application without like pushing it up to GitHub and then waiting for Composer to update or packages to update and then sort of Composer updating to pull down the package into your app. There's really a better way to do that locally. So if I come into this package, you can see I have a Composer file that just, maybe needs this UUID library and Mockery and PHP unit. And let's just call this Laravel package as an example. And I can actually pull this into the package app. If I look at my Composer file here, by defining a path repository. So if I was going to build a new Laravel package, this is really how I would set it up. And this is how I do have it set up for, Horizon, which is a package I'm working on now. I'll just define a path repository back into that package directory. And then once you have defined this block right here, I can just come up here and just require it just like any other package. And once I run Composer update, it will do all the sim linking and update the dependencies for me and pull in whatever dependencies that package needs. And then I can actually just utilize this package, just like any other package that was installed via Composer. So I have this printer class in my package that just echoes out any text I give it, and I can use it within my package app. If I hit that route, which I think I have bound here, you can see I get hello world up here. So that's how I build packages on Laravel. I get asked that quite a bit. And we used to have in prior versions of Laravel, this sort of Laravel workbench, and there's been other things that sort of were supposed to make this easier. But I feel like the Composer path repository is sort of the best option there. And if anyone has any other questions, I can talk about them either about today's talk or the Laravel ecosystem. I'm not sure how much time we have, but
I'll hop on here. Yeah, we got 10 minutes or so. You blew everyone's mind with your font size and font face, so that was a distraction for the kids for the first half an hour. But we've moved on. There was one I picked up on. Do you have any plans to make Dusk available outside of Laravel, or if that's even possible? I don't know what you've thought about that.
I don't really have any plans on it myself. Sort of my philosophy there is I don't even really concern myself when I'm building things like Dusk or Spark or Horizon about making them usable outside of Laravel. And that sounds really selfish, but a lot of people kind of look at it as sort of coupled to Laravel, but I prefer to look at it as like more exclusive to Laravel and sort of flip the terminology like you do.
I love it.
Because Laravel has so much power that I couldn't depend on to be there in other circumstances. Like, for example, I'm building Horizon right now, and I want Horizon to be able to send notifications in certain situations, and maybe the same way with Dusk too in the future. But Laravel already has this nice notification component that can just tap right into. And so to make that not Laravel specific would just be a lot of work, right? I would have to have like this notification sender interface and write all these different implementations of that and all that. And it's just sort of easier for me to build more valuable things if I just tie it to Laravel, because I can use all of the great stuff that's already there with queues and notifications and stuff like that. So if it happens that something is usable outside of Laravel, that's great. Like it's just like a coincidence basically.
Right.
But I really don't worry about it when I'm building something, which I guess is selfish and controversial, but I feel like it lets me build better quality stuff really at the end of the day.
Yeah, well, and also when you get those higher level packages, it's like if you make them generic, it just loses a lot of the power, like you said. So
yeah,
the low level stuff makes so much more sense to be generic. But
yeah, sure. Like a dependency injection container, easy to make generic. But right. Yeah, the higher you go, like you said, in the sort of level of abstraction, like once you get to like Spark level abstraction, there's no way you're making that framework, agnostic.
Yeah, exactly. Or you're just building it as a whole app, which is then a whole separate thing. All right, so Dusk. So I don't know. Did you want? Well, there was one other question before I get to this one. Did you this Laravel package? Is that something that's like available to people in general?
Oh, that was just like a dummy namespace example.
Okay.
So no,
Or your setup. I guess they can get the setup out of this video, really, because
yeah, you just look at the video and how I set up the path repository, and then the composer docs have information about that path repository. I usually have to Google for it pretty hard to find it. But check that out because it's sort of a lesser known, really valuable part of Composer. I think it was added maybe a year ago or so.
Well, this is kind of a little thing to take out of this talk too. It's like the lesser known, like diving deep into some of these things is useful because you know, you're using these things that are some deep buried feature in Composer that you know you need to know about that, and kind of like even the whole thesis of this talk really is getting under the covers a little bit and seeing how things work.
Yeah.
Did you have anything? Obviously, the other big thing in here is Horizon. I'm sure you're not going to drop the big Horizon bomb on us, but I don't know if you have anything you wanted to tell people about that, or just even how it's going, or whatever you want.
Yeah, it's going pretty well. I've actually really enjoyed working on it. And I think it's going to be something that's really useful for a lot of applications. It's not something as specific as Spark, but one reason I've really enjoyed working on it is because it's given me a lot of opportunity to work on TDD and in a Laravel context, and especially with all the stuff that Adam has put out recently, you know, from the last talk. Yeah. Talking a lot with him on good ways to test things, what are actually valuable tests, and I feel like Horizon is sort of the best test I've written so far, and so I'm excited to get it out into people's hands because I feel like it's going to be a really high quality thing that I really believe in a lot. And of course, if you're coming to New York, that's where I plan on demoing it on stage. Right. And we'll have video of that. We'll have live streams of that, so people will be able to watch that then.
That's going to be awesome.
But next year for Laracon Online, you know, once we have more time to sort of prep it, we're going to have to do a big reveal.
Yeah, we'll have you come up with something.
Yeah.
Talk about Laracon US too a little bit here.
Yeah, Laracon US. Of course, it's sold out, and I have 2 more speakers to announce that we haven't got out there yet. I'm pretty excited about the speaker lineup. We have Matt Stauffer and Jeffrey Way back. They were out last year having kids and doing responsible adult things, but they're back this year. And of course, we have Evan, who was speaking earlier, Adam, and I think I'm really excited. We have some other speakers that I'm trying to reach out to, speakers that have sort of been around the Laravel community. They've contributed a lot, and sort of way to say, hey, these are people that have been excited about Laravel for a long time, and they have some interesting things to say. So, for example, one talk I'm kind of interested in is Matthias Hansen and his wife actually are going to do a joint talk on them bootstrapping an application on Laravel from, you know, just a side project to now it's making a, you know, 6-figure project on Laravel just as a side project. Tom Slick, I guess is how you would say his last name. He's going to talk about multi-tenancy in Laravel, which is something I get tweeted about basically every day, is how to do multi-tenancy in Laravel. So I think
I've tweeted you about that actually. So.
Yeah, so I'm excited to get that video out there, and I can just link to that video for all time. But yeah, it's going to be fun. We'll have a good venue. We'll have a little after party after the conference where you can mingle with people. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, it's going to be cool.
And don't forget about Laracon EU too. It's just 1 month after that. So they still have tickets on sale, and I'll be there as well. Yeah, it should be a good time. That's always a really good, well put together conference as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, I didn't go last year, but it looked insane with that new venue they have. And
yeah,
stuff.
We'll never top that venue, I don't think.
we gotta bring Laracon US to Europe to top that venue. I guess.
No, seriously.
That's crazy. All right, man. Well, thanks a lot.
All right, thanks.
Awesome as always. Having